wonderful and long introduction. I didn't expect it, and thank you for this wonderful opportunity to speak and to present my new project that actually grew out of my current interests in the history of Muslim subjectivity in the former Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union. And the thing is that in our project at the University of Amsterdam, we've been focusing more at the private collections. So we were trying to map them and see how the sense of individuality was present or being constructed by the manuscript holders. But what to a large extent remained out of our reach during our in research is actually the history of state holdings, the history of the great collections of manuscripts in Kazan, in St. Petersburg, and in Ufa, of which we'll be talking about later. If I may ask you to move to the following. Thank you. So this is the main guiding question that we'll have for today. So basically, what are the archival histories of items kept today at the state repositories of Islamic manuscripts in Russia? And it appears to be, first of all, that such histories of manuscripts and manuscript collections that entered into the Orientalist archives are often simply not written or being ignored and marginalized in scholarship. But once we try to pose questions and explore the sources pertaining to these histories, we can discover quickly that there are so many individuals, so many objects and multiple ties that bring them together, that indeed I'm now in the middle of writing a book completely devoted to this to these stories. So on the next slide, we'll see that there are basically three main cities in Russia that are still keep the biggest collections of Islamic manuscripts and printed books. Can we move forward, please? Yeah. So Kazan is the biggest center for Islamic manuscripts in Russia. Kazan University Library today hosts some 20,000 manuscripts and around the same number of old printed books in the Arab script. The Institute of Language, Literature and Arts also has a considerable collection. There are also manuscripts at the National Library and the National Museum. So Leningrad, St. Petersburg is also a famous center of imperial collection of manuscripts. And there is also a collection in Ufa, the capital of the Republic of Bashkortostan. These manuscripts were mainly gathered during the manuscript expeditions in the Soviet era. So in my talk, I will be referring to some of these collections, and basically the story of Sabir Alimov is a part of the history of these collections. So next slide, please. The idea of writing something or digging into the ethnographies of Islamic manuscript collections in Russia and trying to understand the methodologies, ideologies, and motivations that stood behind the collecting efforts in the 20th century. I kind of own these ideas and own in the intellectual exchange with these two books that I find extremely thought-provoking and useful. So one of them is a recent monograph by Margrethe von Oswald, working through colonial collections. This is an excellent research on exactly these ethnographies of institutions that were meant to gather artifacts and to classify them and to work on them to present them to public or to hide them. So all these practices and ideas about the colonial collections are being analyzed in this wonderful book. And kind of, I thought, going in parallel with the author of this book, I also thought that it's possible to do similar research and to write the histories of Russian colonial or Russian imperial collections of Islamic manuscripts and how they developed and what was their peculiarities. Another book that I came across only recently, but it's already a book from the early 2000s, I believe, by Wendy Shaw, Possessors and Possessed. I'm sure many of you know this book. It's devoted to the idea of cultural legacy in the Ottoman Empire and the way how museums were opened there and how archaeology was taken as a primary tool for nation building and similar things. So I sort of pick up the methodology from both monographs and try to apply the findings and ideas and concepts from these two books to the material that I find in the state archives in Russia. So next slide, please. These are some of the preliminary observations that I have so far in my ongoing project with this history of Muslim book collections in Russia. First of all, one of the main peculiarities in our case is that Tatar manuscripts, or the manuscripts of Russia's Muslims, were collected by the Tatars themselves, mainly and chiefly, and not by imperial Orientalists. And I believe this is quite peculiar because when we think about Orientalist practices, we can often imagine like this transfer of knowledge and objects carried out by Western scholars mainly. But here, what we see is that the majority of actors and those individuals who were busy collecting manuscripts across the Russian Empire, the former Russian Empire and the early Soviet Union, they were Tatars, and they were sometimes Muslims in their faith and their education, in their cultural background, or they had roots in this. They had personal connection to what they've been collecting and studying. Still, these we shouldn't take these identity issue at face value, because the manuscript holdings that came into being in the 20th century bear a strong imprint of modernist thinking. And here, this is actually the point when I refer back to these two wonderful monographs that I just cited on the previous slide, where we have these Eurocentric ideas of cultural legacy and the the idea of using cultural artifacts for the nation building and transformation of the items of everyday life into museum objects and objects of archival preservation. So books of Islamic subjects were turned into manuscripts, right? And this is what was carried out in the case of Russian state archives, not by the colonial Orientalists, but rather by the Tatar Muslim intellectuals themselves. So, and here we can also observe two strands of Orientalist practices. One by the Tatar scholars, who would themselves separate manuscripts according to their languages, would segregate the printed and manuscript materials, and would also do not pay attention to individual collections. Those collections would be dispersed in the archival collections, often not kept separately and not being thought of as entities, right? So there are also Orientalist practices by Orientalists, by kind of those who didn't have any kind of connection to the culture that they were studying. And there we see a lot of marginalization of local subjects and their projects. So what we'll see in the case of Sabir Alimov in particular is this attempt to downplay his importance in acquiring the manuscript, and also negating the even the possibility that these people, these individuals and scholars, they had their own ideas about how to use these objects and how to make sense of them, right? So that to a great extent contributed to the fact that the names, even the names of these early collectors and book traders, they were obscured from the history of archival collections. Right. So basically, my further talk will be just some illustration of these observations. And yeah, let's just proceed to the following slide. Here, I would like also to pay attention to the fact that, of course, my research here has a lot to do with the decolonial attempt to see the roots of the Orientalist knowledge and the way how it was constructed, and what were the parallel alternative ways of knowledge production, and what were the other ways of handling these artifacts and making sense out of them. Still, what I sort of quickly came to recognize is the fact that the archival collections that we are dealing with today, they are themselves the result of modernist thinking. And actually, if we sort of pursue and follow the decolonial idea of celebrating the local practices of handling manuscript material, then we have to recognize that that many practitioners of the manuscript culture would prefer to destroy their books generation after generation. So the idea that how do we preserve? We do not keep books with us in this world, but rather we just bury them at the cemetery, so that the barakah, the blessing of these old books, remains within the community. And it also it is kind of, it's a very pragmatic in a way approach to manuscripts, not establishing a separate archive in order to refer to it from time to time and examine those texts, but rather to approach these items spiritually. And I've seen some references to occult practices similar to this one, which associate destruction with keeping the sacred qualities of these books. So I think we have to keep this in mind, that actually, if we bring the colonial idea to its extreme, we have to assume or recognize that actually there was no such an idea to preserve the manuscripts in archives in the way how we used to them. All right. So next slide, please. With Sabir Alimov, we see an example of such an intellectual who was heavily influenced by the modernist and reformist Jadidi thinking, who first received his education in Bukhara, according to the fashion of previous generations of Tatar scholars, but was not satisfied by the level of education given there, and continued his studies in Cairo at the al-Azhar University. So upon his return to Russia, he taught at multiple madrasas, including the reformist Husainiya madrasa in Orenburg. And then he moved to Astrakhan, where he spent the rest of his life teaching Arabic and other subjects at the local school. So you wouldn't see here in his biography anything really particular related to the highest echelons of Islamic intellectual life. So he didn't write any books on Islamic law or something like that. He wasn't directly involved into networks of Islamic knowledge production, at least as far as we know. But he was a student who received classical education from the Reformist centers of Islamic learning, and then he applied his visions of this modern Islam into practice by just teaching children. But what happened in the 1930s, so decades after his tenure at the madrasas, at the time of the um, state-sponsored destruction of Islamic infrastructures in the former empire, was that his Alimov's expertise in Islamic culture and Islamic literature became useful for Soviet Orientalism. So for the newly established Institute of Oriental Studies in Leningrad, which was interested in acquiring new items and turning them into sources of knowledge about the Soviet East and the peoples of the Soviet Union. So we move forward to the following slide. As a result, or what is it that Sabir Alimov was doing? In the course of the 1930s and the early 1940s, himself and his wife, Sabira, they were shipping manuscripts regularly from Astrakhan to Leningrad. So both of them, they were busy acquiring manuscripts in their neighborhood, sometimes at cemeteries as well. They would say that they would rescue these manuscripts, but as I told you already, that was not the initial idea. The idea was the idea of practitioners that these manuscripts were destined to be buried or kept at the mausoleums and to preserve the barakah within the community. But the reformist Sabir Alimov actually thought that it's better to donate those items of historical importance to the centers, to the center of Soviet Orientalism in Leningrad. So this is one of the letters that you see here, sent by the scholars in Leningrad back to Astrakhan, with the list of items received from Sabir Alimov. And what is kind of also relevant to the topic of our series of talks is that Alimov was requesting to be paid for his service, and in a way that was a continuation of the more traditional practices of book trade. Formerly, nobody was officially allowed to sell Islamic religious literature in the Soviet Union because there was no, it was forbidden. It was not part of the legitimate practice. But in the case of scholarship, that was kind of allowed because these were deemed to be cultural objects that the institute, the academic institute, was acquiring for scholarly purposes. So this ambivalence of how to see these payments, right? Is it the book trade, or is it acquiring of cultural items? So this ambivalence is out there with the money involved. Next slide, please. This is just to give you an idea of where the localities that I'm talking about are situated. So on the south, the circle is Astrakhan, very important place for the Sufi learning at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century. Those of you who are interested can be referred to a wonderful book chapter in the Festschrift devoted to our esteemed Stefan Reichmuth. There is an article by Michael Kemper and Shamil Shekhalif, exactly on the importance of this city for Sufi networks, the interregional Sufi networks. So you see there St. Petersburg in the north and the city of Kazan in the middle. Next slide, please. So there are several things peculiar to Soviet Orientalism and maybe colonial practices of dealing with the manuscript items more broadly. First of all, it's the idea of looking for unique items. Many people who were sitting in Leningrad and receiving these sendings from Astrakhan, they would really look at these materials with a critical eye and would expect Alimov to send them only unique things and rare things, rather than something characteristic of the local literary production. That's one thing. And another one is that this of course also involved the practices of selection and marginalization of certain items, so that they would pick up things and be really demanding from Alimov and tell him directly, as in this case, this quote below, that Alimov has to make a selection of books before even sending them, because at the institute there is a surplus of such manuscripts as Isaguchi, Mukhtasar, and Fiqh Kaidani. So you can imagine that why such quotes and such practices are important for us as maybe simple users of libraries today. Because often we as historians might approach these archives uncritically and simply think that, oh, whatever we find in the archive is just a replica of, or some remnants of, the actual cultural repertoire that was at some point present out there, say in Astrakhan. But once we see the archival histories of these items, we can trace the complexities of selection, and we can realize that, first of all, not all of the materials that were out there made their way to the archive, one thing. And another one is that even those things that managed to be sent to St. Petersburg, to Leningrad, they could have been not even inventoried and didn't enter the Orientalist catalogs of manuscripts, because they were not rare. They were not perceived as important for scholarship. Next slide, please. And we have to also remember that the actual political context for acquiring the manuscripts from Alimov was in the 1930s, so the era of the Stalinist repressions. And there is a very telling example with this letter sent by one of the institute workers. It's an inner communication at the institute. So I quote here: "We have no idea about the political physiognomy of Comrade Galimov, but he has our documents that allow him to travel around the kolkhozes in the Astrakhan region. There is no guarantee that he will not abuse the opportunities afforded by his current job." So they count their payments as a job given to him. "As we cannot control him from Leningrad, manuscripts and books sent by him, especially the last time, are of no particular value." You see, right? So these selection processes were going on, and sometimes the value judgments that made by the institute workers were pretty harsh and arrogant, I would even say, especially given that he requires payment for manuscripts and his service. So I think on the part of Alimov, he would still perceive this engagement as book trade, even in the 1930s. "We can buy valuable manuscripts from even without Alimov's assistance," claim the institute workers. "Therefore, we decided to break our collaboration with Alimov," which is not quite true, because they continued to do so even after Alimov's death, and his wife Sabira sent even more manuscripts after that, and nobody sort of objected. So from these quote and similar, we see that the archival landscape appears to be almost a battlefield. with multiple individuals and agents who have their own vision of what is going on, with the fears of the institute workers that the collaboration with Alimov might cause some political problems to those in Leningrad. So it was really a scary and uncertain situation in the 1930s that also resulted into the acquiring of this body of texts. Next slide, please. Right, so we go further with the Orientalist classifications that in the course of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, so later on in decades that follow, organized the manuscripts that were sent by Alimov. First of all, his manuscripts were not described as an entity. So nobody cared about just having them separate and to think of his books as characterizing, for example, the cultural region of Astrakhan. Each work in a miscellany was cataloged according to their language. So Arabic texts within a single collection or a single miscellany would be cataloged together with Arabic texts from other manuscripts. The same goes for Persian and Turkic texts. So each manuscript as an object was then cut into pieces and then published. Information about them was published in different catalogs, and I'll show you examples of it. And then within such catalogs, then separate texts were also classified according to their genre. So it is, first of all, becomes almost impossible, very difficult to imagine how these manuscript miscellanies looked like. You have to look through every language catalog and then try to piece this individual text together. And also, it's very difficult then to have an image, a holistic image of the all of the manuscripts that were sent by Alimov. So one of the examples of these complexities is the erotic poetry written by Abdurrahim al-Bulghari, the early 19th century. So this text was part of a manuscript volume sent by Alimov in 1936 from Astrakhan to Leningrad. So this miscellany included works on medicine, jurisprudence, and occult sciences. And all of these titles were spread among 3 catalogs, which I will list on the following slides. So here is the catalog of Persian manuscripts, which has at its end just a list of items described in the book, which stem from or originate from Alimov's collection. So, I mean, it is possible to work with this, but really complicated. Next slide, please. This is the catalog of Arabic manuscripts of the collection in St. Petersburg, and the same thing. You just have a list of items that were described in different places of this catalog. All of them go back to the initial Alimov's collection. And finally, on the next slide, we see the Dmitrieva's catalog of Turkic manuscripts. And here also we see just an enumeration of items cataloged from Alimov's collection. So these manuscripts were described at different times in different catalogs without, well, there is information that it all belongs to the same entity, but there is no reflection about it, right? And there is no idea of how these things relate to each other and what are the features of this collection sent by Alimov. Right, we move further to the next slide. What was also going on between the former ulama and Muslim Turkic intelligentsia, as well as the Soviet Orientalists, is the competition going on for the right, who has the right to speak for the legacy of Islam in Russia. So here you see Zeki Validi Tagan, the famous Bashkir and then Turkish historian, who directly accused in one of his monographs, accused Russian Orientalists in stealing the findings of Alimov and pretending that it is them who made the discovery of a dictionary of the Khwarezmian language that was indeed sent from Astrakhan by Alimov. And on the next slide, we see that this story of marginalizing Alimov from the history of the collection and ascribing him only the role of the assistant, of a research assistant of Imperial Orientalists. We can find it in the writings of contemporary Russian Arabists, such as Stanislav Prozorov, who writes in one of his articles that it was the Russian Arabist Belyaev who was the first to mention the manuscript of an unknown biographical dictionary in the manuscript collection of St. Petersburg collection. While working on the collection in 1953, he singled out this manuscript acquired in 1939 from the Astrakhan book collector Alimov as of outstanding interest. So basically, the contemporary Orientalist tradition starts the history of research on a particular item from the Russian Orientalist Belyaev, and not from the ideas, whatever ideas that Alimov could have had while sending this item to Leningrad. All right, next slide, please. Peculiar to mention is that further in the 1960s, in the 1970s, there was a process of collecting other Islamic manuscripts that remained in private possession across Soviet Russia. And Mirkasim Usmanov, data historian of the time, was also became interested in the private archive of Sabir Alimov once he found himself in Astrakhan in 1969. So this is what he writes about his discovery. I looked at the archive of Sabir Alimov. It is extremely rich. There are letters from the academicians Samailovich and Struve from Leningrad, the letters from the manuscript scholars Zabirov and Muginov, also from the same locality. Multiple documents. It's great. As a result, the role of Sabir Alimov in the collection of Oriental manuscripts becomes completely clear. So unlike his colleagues from Leningrad, Usmanov was more interested in the agenda of Alimov. So what was his role? What was his vision on these items as constituting the idea of national cultural heritage? And actually, it was Usmanov who brought this private archive of Sabir Alimov to the academic scientific library of Kazan University, and now it's kept in Kazan. And in a way, if one wants to understand the collection of Alimov in St. Petersburg, it is really important to consult his private papers and correspondence brought by Mirkasim Usmanov. So one of the final slides that we have, the next one. Basically, this is the final slide. Why do we care? Why do we care about these archival histories of some obscure actors trying to preserve or sell manuscripts and to discover for themselves new forms of archival practices? What is it? What is the value of it? So these are three ideas that I propose. First of all, attention to scholars' subjectivity, such as Sabir Alimov in our case, allows to analyze their motivations for the collection and study of manuscripts. exactly those manuscripts which we then use for our historical reconstructions. And I believe that one cannot make a step in the colonial archives without knowing, being aware of the multiple competitive views and battlefields, as I said earlier, which these archives in fact constitute. That's one thing. Another one is that archival histories often lead us to multiple horizontal connections between actors with sometimes conflicting visions. So we see many people involved, not only Orientalists, but also the former Muslim scholars, journalists, Tatar national historians, or also one shouldn't forget about the important role of women in the process of acquiring, preserving, and transmitting manuscripts, or using them in occult practices and in multiple alternative ways, not only for the production of Orientalist knowledge. So without looking back at the archival histories of manuscripts, we wouldn't be able to appreciate the role of these women, right? And finally, private collections open the door for appreciation of local cultural traditions, often obscured by the Orientalist practices of classification and marginalization. In principle, in many cases, writing the history of manuscript collections in Russia appears to be really an attempt to disclose those narratives and those voices that are hidden uh, under the layers of colonial neglect and discourses that often obscured and covered the ideas that were held by the initial collectors of those manuscripts, and without even speaking about the earlier generations of those who produced these items and somehow arranged them in collections before these books entered the imperial or Soviet holdings. So this is basically what I wanted to tell you in regard of Sabir Alimov and some of the preliminary ideas of my new book. I hope it was not completely boring and you might have questions. Thank you for your attention.